A neighborhood dispute takes a sharp turn when uniforms arrive at a doorstep they don't fully understand. What happens when the past holds more power than a badge? Let us know in the comments section below where you're watching from and what you would have done in that moment. Miranda Sherwood sat in her armchair, the one by the bay window, with a half-drunk cup of chamomile resting on a porcelain saucer. Her spine was straight, posture graceful, as if she were still presiding over a courtroom and not watching squirrels dart across her azalea bushes. Her eyes, sharper than her age suggested, didn't just watch. They evaluated, remembered, recorded. The woman who once held attorneys in contempt with nothing but a raised brow now spent her mornings whispering to plants, pressing her fingers into the dirt as if to feel the pulse of the land. Her neighbors thought of her as polite but distant, the kind of woman who never missed Sunday service, yet stayed seated when others stood to testify. That was fine by her. Let them think she was just old. Let them forget. She didn't want recognition anymore. What she wanted, needed, was peace. The knock came not like a question but a statement. 3 hard raps that shook the brass knocker against her front door like a gavel. Miranda didn't move at first. The world didn't come to her door anymore, and when it did, it usually meant trouble. She set her cup down and stood slowly, letting the stiffness work its way out of her knees. As she reached the door, a voice barked from the other side. "This is Officer Carver with the Summit Heights Police Department." "Open the door, ma'am. This is an official matter." Her fingers paused on the deadbolt. Dale Carver had only been with Summit Heights PD for 5 years, but in that time he'd made himself known. The kind of officer who wrote tickets for cracked taillights and loitering in front of the barber shop, but only to the young black men who crossed into the richer neighborhoods. He was sharp-jawed, sharp-tempered, and still believed that uniforms came with automatic authority. Behind him stood Officer Tony Alvarez, still green, his eyes darting around like he'd rather be anywhere else. Carver didn't notice the hesitation in his partner, or maybe he did and simply didn't care. Miranda opened the door slowly. "Good morning, officers," she said, her voice silk and steel. "May I help you?" "We're here on behalf of the City Housing Authority," Carver said, holding up a folded stack of papers. "This property has been declared in default. You've been served a final eviction notice. We're here to enforce that order." Miranda didn't blink. "You must be mistaken." "No mistake, ma'am. The paperwork says Miranda Sherwood, 2214 Magnolia Lane. That's you, isn't it?" She took the papers without looking at them, her eyes locked on Carver. "Yes, that's me." Alvarez shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, we really don't want any trouble. We just need to—" "I have lived in this home for 47 years, Miranda said. "I bought it outright with my husband in 1978. There is no mortgage, no lien, no legal grounds for eviction." "Well, now there is," Carver snapped. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She opened the papers then, thumbing through them with the precision of someone who had once dismissed motions and filed injunctions with a flick of her pen. Her lips pressed together, her mind cataloging the errors, the forged notary stamp, the signature that didn't match her own. "This is fraudulent," she said calmly, "completely illegitimate." "That's not for you to decide," Carver growled, already stepping onto her porch. "You can take it up with the court later." "No," she said, voice low but cutting. "I am the court." Carver paused. Alvarez blinked. Miranda's hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the rising fury she had trained for decades to master. She inhaled deeply, as if gathering every ounce of patience and dignity she had ever cultivated. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is misconduct," she said. Carver stepped forward, one boot scraping over the threshold. "Ma'am, if you don't vacate willingly, we'll have to arrest you for obstruction." It was then that Miranda turned from the door. "Wait here." Carver scoffed. "That's not how this works." But she was already walking. Through the hallway lined with photographs, her and her husband in black and white. their hands interlocked in front of their first courtroom, her shaking hands with Thurgood Marshall, a younger Miranda standing on courthouse steps beneath a banner that read, "Justice is ours too." She moved with purpose to the study, unlocked the drawer in her filing cabinet, and pulled out a document. Then another, then the third, the most important. A federal court order with her own name at the bottom. The Honorable Miranda Sherwood. Ink still fresh. By the time she returned to the front door, Alvarez was murmuring, "Maybe we should call this in." But Carver wasn't backing down. He was the type that had to win, even when he didn't know the game. Miranda handed him the court order, her eyes never leaving his. "I suggest you read that very carefully," she said, "before you make a mistake neither of you can walk back from." Alvarez leaned in, reading silently, his mouth open slightly. "Judge Sherwood," he whispered. Carver's eyes narrowed. "What?" He snatched the paper, skimmed it, his color draining as realization crept in. "I'm the presiding judge for the federal investigation into internal misconduct within this precinct," Miranda said. "That includes falsified evictions and abuse of authority." The porch was silent, except for the faint rustle of magnolia leaves. Miranda stepped back inside. "You have 1 minute to leave my property." The cruiser idled in the driveway longer than it needed to. Dale Carver sat in the driver's seat, jaw clenched tight, fingers twitching on the steering wheel. His pride had taken a hit, but what truly burned was the realization that he'd just threatened a federal judge, one with jurisdiction over his entire department. Tony Alvarez didn't speak. He just stared out the window, visibly shaken, his face pale under the brim of his hat. That wasn't just some old lady," Tony muttered, breaking the silence. "No," Carver said through gritted teeth. "It wasn't. We need to report this." "Sir, if we don't tell the captain." I said no. Tony turned, his eyes wide. "You serious?" Carver leaned forward, pressing his forehead to the top of the steering wheel for a moment before sitting back. "We go back there with paperwork that doesn't hold up and we get laughed out of the department. We bring in that court order and they'll ask us why we were even at her door in the first place." "She's the presiding judge over the corruption trial," Tony said, voice cracking slightly. "This could blow back on the entire force." Carver didn't answer. He threw the cruiser into reverse and pulled out of the driveway, the tires crunching the gravel like brittle bones. Miranda Sherwood watched from behind her lace curtain, her expression unreadable, calm, but her fingers, those fingers that once penned justice, tightened into a fist at her side. An hour later, she stood in her garden. She clipped the roses precisely, not out of routine, but to focus her thoughts. Her house, though beautiful and full of history, no longer felt entirely her own. It was violated now, not by force, but by arrogance. That's what scared her the most. They didn't come because they believed she'd done something wrong. They came because they assumed she couldn't stop them. The city had changed. Miranda hadn't wanted to come back to the bench. Not after everything. Not after burying Charles. He used to sit right there, on the porch swing, pretending not to watch her prune these very same bushes while he read the paper. She'd given so much to the system. Decades of her life, integrity, rulings that carved precedent. And now it turned its back on her like she was nobody. She heard the gate creak and turned. Tanya Reed stood there, heels clicking confidently as she made her way up the path. Her dark blue suit was immaculate, her locks pulled into a tight bun, and her phone already in her hand. "Tell me it isn't true," Tanya said before Miranda could speak. "I got 3 missed calls from someone who works in clerical down at the county clerk's office. Says your name showed up on an eviction enforcement order. Tell me it was a mistake." "I wish I could," Miranda said. Tanya looked at her like she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Miranda smiled faintly. "I'm still standing." "Did they try to—" Tanya began, but then her tone shifted, low and dangerous. "Were they aggressive?" "One of them tried to push his way in." "Jesus." "But they left, eventually." Tanya took a deep breath. I want the full paperwork. I'm going to trace every name that touched it. Whoever falsified those documents is going to regret it." "You think this ties back to the Greer case?" Miranda asked softly. Tanya didn't even hesitate. "You're overseeing a trial that's going to implicate a third of this city's political leadership. Half the cops on the force are sweating bullets because of the subpoenas you've signed. Someone wants you rattled. They don't know who they're dealing with." Miranda's gaze drifted to the courthouse in the distance. "No, they don't. But they will." Later that evening, Miranda stood alone in her study, the curtains drawn. Her bookshelves were lined with law journals and old photographs, case files bundled neatly with color-coded tabs. She pulled out a dusty, worn file from her personal archive, a sealed envelope tucked into the front. She broke the seal. Inside was a letter from Charles. He'd written it before his surgery, in case he didn't make it. It was short, but heavy. "If you ever feel like the world's turned on you, don't run, stand. Fight with that same fire that made me fall in love with you in '69. The law forgets, people forget, but you remember, and you remind them." Miranda folded the letter back up, her eyes shining. The next morning, she walked into City Hall, head held high. Staff paused as she passed. Some whispered, others stood. She didn't stop until she reached the records division. "I'm requesting public access to property liens filed in the last 60 days, she said to the clerk. "Yes, Your Honor," the young woman stammered, hurrying to the back. Miranda knew what she was doing. The eviction notice that reached her house wasn't an isolated event. It was a test of how far someone was willing to go to discredit her. She needed to know how many others had been targeted, how many didn't have the knowledge, the reputation, or the court order to stop it. When the clerk returned with the files, Miranda sat down and began to read. Names, families, elderly homeowners, mostly black. She closed her eyes for a moment, heart heavy. This wasn't about her, not just her. It was about a system that didn't believe in memory. That counted on silence, on fear. Well, they picked the wrong house this time. Back at home, Miranda picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. A voice answered, old and familiar. "Miranda Sherwood, you still alive, girl?" "Barely," she said with a faint smile. "What you need?" "I need a coalition," she said, "like the old days." There was a long pause on the line. Then, "You got it." The hallway lights inside the precinct flickered weakly overhead, casting a jaundiced glow across peeling posters and decades-old honor plaques. Officer Carver stood alone in the evidence locker, the door closed behind him. He wasn't supposed to be here, not alone, not unsupervised. But he had a key and he had purpose, the kind of purpose that made rules feel negotiable. The file folder sat at the bottom of a metal drawer labeled Archived Administrative. The stamp across it read Sherwood, M, in thick red ink. He pulled it out, fingers trembling slightly. It was thin. Too thin for someone who'd been involved in the justice system for over half a century. But this wasn't about her legal legacy. This was about leverage. He flipped through the pages. A juvenile citation from 1965 for civil disturbance. A march in Selma. Expunged, of course. A sealed court proceeding from the 1980s. No details, just a docket number. Probably a threat she'd received, or an attempted character smear during a confirmation hearing. Nothing usable. Nothing that could tarnish her now. Still, Dale didn't put the folder back. He didn't like the way she'd looked at him. Not just with judgment, but with certainty. Like she'd already calculated the weight of his actions and found him lacking. That look had followed him into his dreams, gnawed at his pride like a rat in a pantry. He tucked the file under his arm and walked out. Across town, Miranda Sherwood walked into the Southside Legal Aid Center, where Tanya and 3 other lawyers huddled around a table cluttered with files, coffee cups, and laptops. "We've confirmed 12 fraudulent evictions," Tanya said without looking up. 3 have already lost their homes, 7 are fighting it, 2 got court-ordered stays last week, and yours is the only one that got stopped at the door. Miranda nodded slowly. "Pattern?" "Every single one's tied to property that's near development zones. New zoning laws kick in next month. Guess whose name's attached to the approval committee?" "Greer," Miranda said. "Greer," Tanya confirmed. "And he's been working with a shell corporation, Sablewood Holdings, buying up homes before anyone knows they're even on the market." "They use the police to scare people out," one of the junior lawyers said. "No formal foreclosure, just fake notices, force, and confusion. Nobody wants to go to court, they just leave." Miranda sat down. This was bigger than intimidation. This was a quiet takeover. "They think if they move fast enough, they won't need to clean up the mess until after they've cashed out," Miranda murmured. "What do we do?" the young lawyer asked. Miranda looked around the room. Every face was tired but burning, fired up with the same indignation she'd once carried like a badge. "We don't stop it, we expose it." That night, Miranda appeared on a local podcast hosted by an old friend, Maeva Lawson, a retired journalist turned neighborhood truth-teller. The studio was small, just a mic and a folding table in Maeva's converted garage, but her listeners were loyal. "You're telling me," Maeva said into the mic, "that people are being evicted from their homes with forged notices, and nobody's talking about it?" "They are now," Miranda said. "This isn't about back rent. This is about power. It's about corruption that hides behind paperwork. But here's the truth. If they can come for a federal judge, they can come for anybody." Maeva leaned in. "What would you say to the people listening right now?" Miranda's voice didn't waver. "I'd say, lock your doors, know your rights, and don't be silent. If you get a letter, call a lawyer. If a uniform knocks, ask for a badge number. Record everything, because silence is the tool they're banking on." Maeva ended the segment with a promise. They'd dedicate an entire week of shows to uncovering the evictions, and she'd be calling in reinforcements from her old newsroom contacts. By the next morning, Miranda's words had begun to ripple, not viral yet, but local papers picked up the quote. Activists clipped the audio. Flyers were printed and posted outside barber shops, laundromats, and school pickup lines. If they can come for a federal judge, they can come for anybody. Inside City Hall, Deputy Mayor Calvin Greer sat at a table across from a man in a charcoal suit. He wasn't local. His accent was coastal. His watch was worth more than Miranda's house. "This wasn't the agreement," the man said coldly. "You said it would be clean." "It was clean," Greer said, "until someone revived a fossil." "She's not a fossil. She's a loaded gun you forgot to disarm." Greer leaned back, folding his arms. "I'll fix it." "You'd better," the man said, "because if this delays the zoning contracts, the investors pull out, and if they pull out, you're not just broke, you're indicted." Outside, reporters waited. Questions were shouted. Greer slipped out the side door. At the same moment, Officer Tony Alvarez sat alone in his car, listening to Miranda's podcast appearance on his phone. He couldn't stop thinking about her voice, the calmness, the confidence. It didn't sound like a woman desperate to protect herself. It sounded like someone trying to protect everyone else. He paused the audio and stared at his reflection in the windshield. What side was he really on? He picked up his phone and started to type a message, then deleted it, then started again. "I think you need to see something. Meet me. But come alone. A." He hit send. Back at home, Miranda sat at her kitchen table, reading the same eviction notice for the 10th time, searching for the pattern in the details. Something caught her eye this time. The signature. Not the judge's name, it was the notary. A name she hadn't seen in years. Kendra Holloway. Used to work in the records department. Quiet, efficient, and 2 years ago quietly removed for leaking court schedules to developers. Miranda closed the file slowly. The doorbell rang. Tanya's voice called through the door. "Miranda, you need to see this." She opened it to find Tanya holding a tablet. "It's happening again," she said. Miranda stared at the screen. A video. Shaky phone footage. A young black woman crying on her porch as two officers, different uniforms, stood with their hands on their belts. "They're at her house right now." Miranda didn't hesitate. "Let's go." The young woman's name was Amber Duval, 29, a single mother, worked at the library 2 nights a week, and taught online classes to make ends meet. Her son was 9, his name was Isaiah, and he was the one who filmed the video on his mom's cracked phone, the one that had now been viewed almost 10,000 times across local social media. His voice, small and shaking, had whispered, "Please don't take my mom's house," from behind the screen. By the time Miranda and Tanya pulled up to Amber's home, a small 2-bedroom nestled between vacant lots, a small crowd had already gathered. Neighbors, a pastor, a teacher from the elementary school, and in the middle of it, Amber stood with her hands clenched, her lips pressed together to keep from crying, staring down 2 uniformed officers from a neighboring county. Officers who looked uncertain now that cameras and people surrounded them. Miranda stepped forward, her heels crunching across gravel, the crowd parting like water. Tanya walked beside her, tablet in hand. "Officers," Miranda said, "I suggest you stand down." One of the men turned. "Ma'am, this is a legal matter between the county and the resident. It's not legal, and she is not alone." The second officer glanced at his partner. "She's the judge," he muttered. Miranda extended her hand. "Let me see the papers." They hesitated, then handed them over. Miranda scanned the documents, her fingers moving fast, her lips curled. "This signature here," she said, holding it up, "belongs to a notary who lost her certification 2 years ago. And this order? Not real." "We didn't know," one officer said. "Dispatch just gave us the address." "Then walk away, right now." They left. No cuffs, no shouting, just quiet steps and darting eyes. The crowd erupted into cheers. Amber dropped to her knees, overwhelmed, and Isaiah ran into her arms. Miranda stood still, absorbing the moment but already thinking 10 steps ahead. By morning, Miranda was on the courthouse steps. Behind her stood Tanya, Mava, half the legal aid staff, 2 city council members, and representatives from the housing authority, and beside them homeowners. Black, brown, elderly, working class, many still clutching their fake notices, their fear slowly fading into anger. Cameras rolled, microphones extended. "This city has failed its people," Miranda began. "This department, this administration, have allowed private greed to dress itself in public uniform." She held up a copy of the court order, signed with her own seal. "But justice is not silent, and it does not cower." She turned to the crowd. "We will pursue every fraudulent eviction. We will investigate every name tied to Sablewood Holdings and those who partnered with them. And those officers who use their power to intimidate instead of protect, your time is up." Reporters shouted questions. Miranda didn't answer. She walked back inside the courthouse, the doors closing behind her like the final pages of a book being shut with purpose. Inside the judge's chambers, she sat alone for a moment. She pulled out her husband's letter again and smiled. Later that week, a special committee was formed. Deputy Mayor Calvin Greer resigned under health concerns the next day. Before he left office, subpoenas were filed for his phone records, emails, and private accounts. The Shell Corporation dissolved overnight, but the trail of money, of paper, of names was already mapped. The district attorney, after reviewing the evidence compiled by Tanya and her team, opened a public corruption case. Dozens of people came forward with stories, old eviction notices, recordings, text messages. The dam had broken, and at its center was Miranda Sherwood. The woman they had underestimated. The woman who refused to be erased. Tony Alvarez knocked on her door a week later. He stood with his cap in hand, eyes lowered, but voice steady. "I was part of what happened," he said. "I didn't stop it when I should have. But I want to now. I have information, names, schedules, things they didn't file right." Miranda studied him for a long time, then nodded. "Come in." Together they laid the rest of it bare. The following month, Miranda sat at the head of the courtroom, not as a victim, not even as a plaintiff, but as a judge. The trial was televised. The city watched, every word, every testimony. Amber sat in the front row. I sighed beside her, in a shirt and tie 2 sizes too big. When the verdict came down, guilty on 7 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of power, cheers echoed down the courthouse steps. People clapped in the streets. A mural appeared a week later, painted on the side of the Legal Aid Center. It showed a black woman in a robe, eyes steady, one hand holding a gavel, the other a scale tipped against shadows. Below it, the words, "The law forgets," but she didn't. Miranda saw it for the first time on a morning walk. She stood there, quietly, a tear streaking down her cheek, unnoticed. Not because of the praise, but because of the crowd it drew. Children pointing, mothers explaining, elders nodding, like they remembered something too. At home, she returned to her garden. The azaleas were blooming again, a little brighter this year. She knelt down and pressed her hands into the soil. Still here, still standing, and this time not alone.